nice article in the Managing Madrid blog. Wonderful lads that do a great job there. And worth reading about that man there. Karim Benzema needs to rest, and the numbers reveal why.
Times ended up almost looking like a 6-3-1. Some very good writing about that on the Managing Madrid website. First-rate podcast as well. Of course, Fede Valverde was a huge part of the equation.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to an episode after a sad day in Real Madrid history when we got embarrassed for the second time in the season by Barcelona. But we're still, I think, 5 points ahead of them in La Liga, and there's plenty to talk about. Today we have, might butcher the name, honestly, you got to pronounce it first.
Ruairidh Barlow. It does. I mean, anyone who's watching the video content here will see the name and understand Siddharth's struggles there, because that is quite understandably very, very difficult. But yes, Ruairidh, it's much more simple. I tend to go by Pablo if I'm ordering a coffee in Spain, because it's just not worth the hassle.
I was going to say Ruairidh because I swear I'd heard it on a video or something played somewhere, but I was like, that doesn't read like Ruairidh, so I'm going to just... But yeah, so Ruairidh, welcome. Before we start, I just want to introduce Ruairidh. You want to introduce yourself and Football Espana, the platform you're the editor of. Football Espana puts out interesting articles. There aren't too many big platforms covering Spanish football in English that I know of. You're one of the few, so please tell us.
Yeah, I mean, Football Espana is kind of your come for all and everything more kind of Spanish football website, because I think we try to cover all of the stories. I mean, a lot of that is Big Two coverage in terms of both Barcelona and Real Madrid. So people here for the Real Madrid coverage will find plenty on Los Blancos, but we try to do more on kind of the other teams too, and kind of delve into a little bit of what they're doing, and that kind of more kind of comprehensive coverage in terms of keeping you on kind of the beat of what's going on with Barcelona, Real Madrid and the rest of the league, but also mix that in with kind of more analysis pieces and pieces where we're kind of going into things in a little bit more depth to give you kind of the balance of not just kind of the shorter kind of stories, because Lord knows, and you'll be well aware, there's a lot of news comes out of these the two big clubs in Spain, and sometimes some of the good stuff can get lost in that. So yeah, it's about trying to find the right balance between that, and that's what Football Espana kind of aims to do. And we've got a small but efficient team that we try and do that with.
Nice, yeah. So that's Football Espana, and today we're gonna be going over all of Spain, like La Liga, the other teams, because we talk about Real Madrid all the time. We will talk a little bit about Real Madrid and Barcelona, but this is really an episode for the bigger picture. And just to remind you all, this is the real deal. So we're 5 points ahead, double checking La Liga table. Yeah, we are 5 points ahead. Atletico is top of the table, 44. Real Madrid second, 43. Barcelona third, 38. So I think we should just start with the title race here after yesterday. Where do you see this going? Like they dropped 6 out of 6 points in 7 games, but we got trucked by them. And maybe Lucas doesn't maybe our defense isn't as bad in small games. But it's just so hard to see this team comfortably winning the league after a game like that.
Yeah, that's quite understandable. I get the kind of meltdown that's occurred, certainly on Twitter, X, Blue Sky, whatever social network you want to follow. Real Madrid fans are certainly in meltdown today, and that's totally understandable, and especially after a game like last night where it seemed like nothing could go right since after Mbappe's goal went in and more or less everything went wrong. And I have to say I'm a little bit more positive. That's the good news for Real Madrid fans. I still have them narrowly as favourites to win La Liga. I think if you look back to Xavi Hernandez, you don't have to win big games to win a La Liga title. And that's what Carlo Ancelotti should hang his hat on, because so far this season, Real Madrid have come up short against the bigger teams. I mean, Atleti was kind of a tight game. They could have won that, perhaps should have won that. I mean, they conceded late on. Barcelona, obviously, the two games have been one-sided, but they have depth, Real Madrid, not in their backline, admittedly, but they do have depth up front. They've got depth in midfield. They've got players that can come in and take off kind of some of the load of those players. Players like Modric, Ceballos, who I think will give them a little bit of an edge for me. And having already come back from one kind of brutal dismantling at the Bernabeu, I think Carlo Ancelotti has it in him to kind of ride this out as well. I think if it was a different manager, if this was Julen Lopetegui, who did get sacked after being dismantled by Barcelona, Ancelotti would be gone. But because it's Ancelotti, because he knows how to kind of ride these crises out, I think Real Madrid could be okay for the rest of the season. Now, does that give them enough to challenge in the Copa del Rey or in the Champions League? I think that's probably more of a worry, and it's an interesting kind of reversal, because I tend to think of Ancelotti as being doubly consistent in the Champions League compared to all of the other top managers, and half as consistent in league competitions. But this season, he's going to have to kind of really put all of his eggs in the La Liga basket, I think. And that essentially comes through beating difficult teams away from home, like the Getafes of the squad, the Leganés, which they've already done. But yeah, going away to these teams that will try and take points off you in their own grounds and try and kind of suffocate and frustrate you, I think that's where Real Madrid can have joy this season. And Atleti are the kind of unknown factor. Can they keep this going? Who knows? Again, I'm always inclined to doubt it. But Real Madrid and Barcelona are going at a slower pace than they have been in the last kind of 2-3 years. And that's when Atleti have won titles, is when Real Madrid and Barcelona both start dropping 10 to 15 points more than they usually do. So I think it's set up, especially for the neutral, in the most fascinating fashion it could possibly be set up. But yeah, I would say don't burn down the White House before it collapses if you're a Real Madrid fan.
Well, you've been watching Barcelona. You've noted, they dropped 6 out of 7 games, they dropped points going into this, and we're getting better. What do you think of the Barcelona you saw in the Super Cup? Did they do something over winter break? Did they reset a little? Are they a little more imposing than they were in those games where they dropped points? Or is it just the bounce of the ball? Because you could argue they played well in some games where they didn't deserve to lose or drop points the way they did as well.
Yeah, I think there's an argument. I think what you're kind of picking up on there's an argument that against Atleti and against Real Madrid in this game just past, they probably played a lot better than they did at the Bernabeu or against Bayern Munich earlier in the season, where they rode their luck a little bit more. Barcelona have been outstanding in the big games, it has to be said, in terms of the way they've gone out, the way they put up with adversity when Bayern kind of came back into the game and really put them under pressure. Against Atleti, they were obviously on the back foot because of their league results, but they put in a good performance and were unlucky to lose that game. And then Real Madrid as well. That first half, Real Madrid should have scored a lot of goals, as I'm sure you'll be well aware. But Barcelona kind of rode that out as well. The big games have not been the problem for this Barcelona side. It's the smaller games, the midweek games against Getafe, where you, again, sorry to really throw Getafe under the proverbial bus here, but it's those games against Getafe midweek which are really harder to get yourself up for. They've got one coming up against Getafe at the Coliseum this weekend coming. So it's those games that Barcelona have struggled in, and it's the depth that they've struggled with. Because if you're Atleti or if you're Real Madrid, Alexander Sørloth being the prime example for Atleti, you can throw him on for 30, 40 minutes in one of these games and he can change the game for you. But Barcelona just don't have that. They don't have somebody that can come in for Lewandowski. Ferran Torres is their closest. Ansu Fati is a non-factor. Dani Olmo and Gavi, perhaps that gives you a little bit more depth, but Frankie de Jong has been, if anything, a hindrance rather than a help for them. So yeah, for Barcelona, the big games have not been an issue this season, and I think they'll continue to be good in them this season at the very least. I think they've almost got as much chance of winning the Champions League, weirdly, as they have of winning La Liga. But yeah, if they have the depth to do that, you look at their two fullback positions, and Real Madrid are not blessed with them, but Barcelona don't have kind of real top level fullbacks behind Jules Koundé and Alejandro Balde. I think that's probably where I see things going wrong for them. Gerard Martin, Hector Fort. Martin was trusted more by Hansi Flick earlier this season, but it hasn't really worked. Fort came through kind of last season. He's a youngster. He's got talent, but Flick doesn't seem to necessarily trust him too much. So Barcelona are an uneven squad. With that, you will get uneven performances, and I think that's the one thing that I have the biggest doubts about. If Barcelona can play at their ceiling, I think they're the best team in Spain this season. But how you put that together across the season is the big question.
That makes complete sense. And that's where the fact that they could look so good, but they couldn't do it for 6, 7, 8 games before consistently, maybe is indicative of that fragility. I think it's interesting that you rotate and you can't impose yourself perfectly against small teams, but when everything comes together, this crazy style that I still think is crazy. Like, it shouldn't. I think if Real Madrid had everything, like if we did our best, it wouldn't work, but we're not doing our best either. And so not only does it work, it looks like it's genius, which is what pisses me off. But
the one nuance I'll add from the Supercopa last night as we speak, Real Madrid, I think Barcelona did drop their line 10 yards much deeper than they did at the Bernabeu. And I think that didn't really play to Real Madrid's strengths. I mean, the goal that they get through Mbappe, that's obviously a counter-attack. It's a little bit of a different situation. But you didn't see Mbappe. I mean, they had one offside. Mbappe didn't get in behind. Vinicius didn't get in behind. I think Barcelona were a little bit deeper because, and I'll give Flick credit here, I think he looked at Bellingham, who kind of plays as that kind of second runner as opposed to necessarily a playmaker on the ball. He looked at Valverde and Camavinga and thought, these guys are not going to break us down with the extra space that we give them in the middle. And we're going to have 4 midfielders in there anyway. So I think that's where Real Madrid kind of came unstuck more than anything. Whereas the Bernabeu, the game kind of swung in different directions and Real Madrid kind of collapsed after the first Barcelona goal. This game, I think they were more outthought and outplayed than they were at the Bernabeu.
I agree completely. And that's what's a little scary too, just that they adjusted and we pretty much like scored. I mean, the only thing we adjusted was that Mbappe wasn't in a funk, like everything else. And I mean, it's just disappointing that they would watch a game like the 4-0 and assume, okay, if Mbappe was normal, we win the game. I mean, that is true, but yeah, the defense is bad. It's a bad time. How legit do you think Atletico are this season? I haven't pulled up their underlying numbers or anything. Do you think they're for real, or you think they just went hot for a bit?
I have trouble diagnosing Atleti because for any normal team, you would say this Atletico Madrid side has so much more to go in terms of ceiling, in terms of what their players could produce. I mean, Julian Alvarez, he missed 2 or 3 really good chances before he scored their winner yesterday against Osasuna. Surloto is obviously kind of coming off the bench. Griezmann has been very good, but I still think he's not necessarily at the level he was kind of from the World Cup onwards for the next kind of year beyond that. And yeah, they've been defending really well in terms of numbers, but I also think they're kind of a little bit more vulnerable than the numbers show so far. So I think they're kind of defensively, I think they're overperforming. Offensively, I think they're underperforming. But that is kind of the recipe that's seen Simeone through at times is kind of, I mean, you look at their last 6 games, 6 of their last 7 games in La Liga have all been 1-goal wins, which tells you that they're not blowing teams away. I think they've got the potential to play a lot better. I also think they've got the potential to defend a lot worse. I mean, you look at the Benfica game, they got blown out 4-0 against them in the Champions League. That was before Simeone had his kind of come to Jesus moment with the squad and said, we need to kind of play better and be a lot more kind of effective and essentially work for each other. So that was before kind of a fundamental shift in their season. But Atleti, I struggle to think they'll keep winning games at the rate they currently are. I think it's whether they can hold on to that defensive solidity, because so far they do have the best defense of the top 3 in the season.
Yeah, for sure. Numerically, it's interesting that Real's defense isn't that far off, but when you watch the games, it doesn't feel like that. And I mean, I think that's also just a function of the player quality is so high and why it's so frustrating as a Real Madrid fan to see guys like Camavinga look like clueless out there when they're just generational. outside the top three, so yeah, we are primed for one of the better title races in many years. So Bilbao fourth. What's going on with Nico Williams? Like, why is he hardly scored this season?
It's a good question. I think early on in the season, you speak to people, I think there is maybe perhaps an acknowledgement that he had a slower start because he was still kind of adapting to life as this kind of mega star that won Spain the Euros, that was a major part in that, and also a major kind of star for Barcelona in terms of the transfer market, and somebody that they pursued quite heavily. I think he was still adapting that. I do think his performances have improved since, but also I would say that Athletic have kind of adjusted their style a little bit. I think they're maybe a little bit less counter-attacking this season than they were last season. I think that's also partly a function of them being in the Europa League, because they need to kind of conserve energy to a different degree than they did last season, where they were one game a week, let's go hell for leather, just really absolutely go for each game as much as we can and put everything into it. I think Nico Williams is also getting the star treatment. I mean, he's 22 years old. He was obviously a quality player before this season, but teams probably weren't paying attention to him in the same way that they are now. And I think that's freed up space for other people as well. I mean, Oyan Sanset is probably having a season that you might expect Nico Williams to be having in terms of his kind of contribution and goals. Berenguer has been very good. Iñaki has actually been much more clinical than Nico this season. So, yeah, I think Nico Williams is experiencing kind of a natural growing pain of becoming a star, but Athletic haven't really suffered for it. And again, Barcelona are closer to Athletic than they are to Real Madrid right now, I think, or Atleti at least. So yeah, that shows you in a league that's a lot tighter this season. Athletic are taking advantage of that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Then looking at some of these other teams in between, I feel like Girona are still good. Are they just not running as hot as last season when everything went in? Maybe no more Alex Garcia, slightly worse in some ways. What are your thoughts? It's also Garcia, I mean, as you might know, has not really made it at Leverkusen quite. It hasn't worked out. They need a athletic midfield two with their back five and their front three or whatever. So they haven't found a place for him. And yeah, what's going on over there? And I mean, playing them, they felt like still as good, but then in the Champions League, they're horrible. Like, they're losing everything and they're unlucky at points. But other people want to use it as a hammer to bash them, that this is why you don't play possession football as Girona. But what do you think?
I think that's a harsh take on Michel, who's done a brilliant job. And still, I think if you look at the salary limits of this squad, they're kind of performing where they should be in terms of La Liga. I mean, Girona were so sensational last season in terms of the kind of way that they went about winning games. They won a lot of games in the last kind of 10, 15 minutes. They were insatiable in their attitude and their confidence more than anything that they were going to get things over the line. And ultimately, Aleix Garcia's huge loss as well. You take him from being kind of the center of operations for one team, and then you put him in Leverkusen, where he's just another guy in midfield to a certain extent. That's obviously going to have an impact on him. But for Girona, I mean, I've seen Girona under Michel a few times live in person, and you notice just how much he used to speak with Aleix Garcia during the game. I mean, I remember watching them against Cadiz, and Cadiz were obviously a tricky team to break down, who put a lot of people in front of the ball, behind the ball. And they were basically just shouting at each other for about half an hour of the game, just kind of back and forth, kind of telling each other where they essentially thought the gaps were to come. And eventually, Aleix Garcia did pop up with the winner on the edge of the box with a lovely shot. So yeah, you lose that guy who was kind of your captain, but also your director in midfield. That's obviously going to have a huge impact. And then Artem Dovbyk, he was lethal last season. He was the most lethal player in La Liga. He was scoring a lot of goals, but also creating a lot of space for his teammates. And Bojan Miovski has come in from Aberdeen. Coming from Aberdeen is the operative there. It's not going to be a kind of easy transition to become a top La Liga goal scorer. And Abel Ruiz, we know, is not kind of clinical in front of goal. He does a lot of good work, but he's one of those players that doesn't really excite you too much. So I think they're suffering from the effects of kind of slightly below par recruitment compared to what they had last season. Sabio's obviously gone to Manchester City as well. And yeah, they're still a good football team. Michel is still a good coach. They're just not kind of a revelation as they were last season, which is to be expected.
That makes sense. A couple more mid-table teams that are on everyone's mind are Villarreal and then Sociedad. First, Villarreal, they are just going through their team, a team of just like old players you would remember, all-stars like Juan Fort, Denis Suarez, Eric Bailly, who went to Man United when Mourinho was there. Everyone remembers him. Raul Albiol, Juan Bernat, like, man, Pep Guardiola's left back at Bayern. It's been a while. And then Nicolas Pepe, we remember him at Arsenal. Danny Parejo, Gerard Moreno. So anything cool about Villarreal this season, you think? I mean, they're always just in the mix as a mid-table team. They never go away. They never get close to relegation like the other team that starts with a V, which is about to get relegated. But what do you think about them?
Yeah, they're a gorgeous football manager team, aren't they? You look at that team and you say, yes, I would like to take over that and take them to the Champions League and maybe win an unlikely league title. But yeah, Villarreal, for me, have been interesting this season. They've obviously got Marcelino in charge. I think he's the star of that side, along with Alex Baena, who I know is not too popular at the Bernabeu, but he's been outstanding again this season. And if you take him out of their side, I think they'd be in a different place. But as it stands, I had them in 4th place at the start of the season, just because I think Europa League will take its toll on Athletic. I still think this Villarreal side can make it into 4th, but if not, they will be 5th place. They've got more firepower than Real Sociedad or Real Betis for me. And yeah, they're a fun team. They need to sort out their backline. I think they've conceded the joint 2nd most goals in La Liga this season, which is pretty insane for a team that's challenging for the Champions League. So if they can sort out their backline, they'll be absolutely fine. And I think they will qualify for Europe, whether that's 4th or 5th place, I don't know. But yeah, they're a fun team. Marcelino, we know he coaches sides to be above their level in terms of the players that he has. And yeah, you can rely on Marcelino as much as you can on any manager in La Liga, perhaps excepting Ernesto Valverde, which is obviously his competition for that 4th spot.
Yeah. Where did Marcelino go to the Premier League ever? I mean,
he did not. No, he went from Athletic, and then he was supposed to get the Spain job until Luis Rubiales appointed Luis de la Fuente, which looked like a really strange move at the time, but turned out to be quite all right.
And then he went to Marseille for a bit. Marseille Olympic for can't see how long.
Yes, he was there for a couple months. The Ultras, I believe they stormed into the stadium at Marseille, started threatening the board, and Marcelino was essentially like, I've had enough of this. I don't need this at my time of life. And quite right. I think the Marseille Ultras are quite intimidating. So I get it where he's coming from there. So he left Marseille and then he came back to Villarreal in their hour of need after they'd been through a couple of managers.
Hey, I mean, they got De Zerbi installed.
They're doing all right now, to be fair. Since Marcelino, it's gone okay, but I think they went through their Rino Gattuso era as well, which is always short-lived, fun, and fiery.
That's so funny how many football teams in Europe just go through the same cycles. The same veteran players that were the same ex-big team players, the same mid-table coaches that couldn't make it at the next level. And then, that really stood out when you said Marcelino. I'm like, that's not even his first time here, right? Yeah, that's his 2nd time here. And he's been at Valencia and Bilbao. It just feels like the Spanish teams just trade coaches sometimes.
Marcelino has said it. He's been pretty vehement, and he said, yeah, look, my CV, I should be at Real Madrid or Barcelona, but they won't hire me because I don't have that pass. I don't have that kind of profile. And it's kind of hard to argue with him. I think if he was in a different era, he probably would be in charge of one of the big 2. But as it is, it's Hansi Flick and Carlo Ancelotti for a 2nd time around.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of it is also, I mean, it's so funny, but like people don't realize it's not all about merit, but sometimes it's just about how you market yourself. and
who you know, and where you are at the right time. I mean, Hansi Flick was an accident who took over from Robert Kovac at Bayern, and now he's kind of, propagated himself or put himself in that kind of elite tier of managers where you can get one of those big jobs. Whereas like Unai Emery, who worked so hard to get into that position, went to PSG and Arsenal, and now is back out of that position. Probably going to struggle to make it back in.
Yeah, and I mean even Company like gets Burnley relegated playing tiki taka, and he gets the Bayern job. And there is truth to it too. Like fundamentally, the job at a smaller team is to like the things you tell the players to do are not the same things you tell them to do at a big team to win. But yeah, that is funny. What about Alguacil? How is he doing? They finally broke the curse and beat Barcelona. Just so used to them not. If I'm not wrong, they always bother us, and they always look like they can bother Barcelona and then just like collapse to them. Atleti and Sociedad, that's big. And also Valencia, like finally got Vinny sent off and still lost the same game. And the same year their City got like whatever happened to them. So all these bogey curses got flipped this year. So what happened with Sociedad? Obviously they won that game. I feel like they're in that weird case where most teams, if they had the same coach and like a homegrown system, you would expect them to get better, but they don't have money, so they just stay the same or stagnate. And maybe they have up years. Is this like a slight up year? Because they had a couple of years where it felt like their defense was the same, attack was getting worse. Where are they now?
Yeah, they're in kind of a funny position. I think, I mean, they qualified for the Champions League 2 years ago, so that was kind of the peak of it. They won the Copa, and 3 seasons ago, and then 2 years ago, they qualified for the Champions League. And I think since then, they've been kind of coming down after that. I mean, they lost Lenormand to Atleti this summer. That was big. Michel Merino obviously went to Arsenal as well. That's another big loss. And Subimendi could well go next summer. He was very close to doing so this summer. So they are kind of in a slight rebuilding phase. The one thing for Real Sociedad, and I've spoken to Roberto Alabe, their sporting director, before, and he is a smart, switched on, no nonsense guy. He's good at his job, and he's leaving at the end of the season, incidentally. But the one blind spot Real Sociedad have had is striker. They cannot for the life of them find a striker. I mean, they've got Ori Oskarsson, who's kind of a promise from Iceland, who's 20 years old, but he's 20 years old and he's a promise, as opposed to necessarily kind of a given thing. Since Alexander Isak left, they've just not really hit on anyone. And even Alexander Sørloth, which makes me think that perhaps Alguacil has something to do with it in terms of stylistically what he asks of his strikers. Sørloth was good, but not great at Real Sociedad. He goes to Villarreal. He's the second top scorer in La Liga. And granted, he's not playing loads at Atleti, but he is scoring lots at Atleti. So yeah, that's the one blind spot they've always had. They're kind of rebuilding a little bit, but they will always kind of be okay because of that academy. And Alguacil is a good manager, but they're going to have to kind of work out some new ways of playing and some new kind of players to rely on, I think. And this season, I see them being kind of in that 6th to 8th kind of range. But Alguacil is putting Real Sociedad are in the most consistent era of their history since the 1980s. So he can't be faulted, I don't think.
That makes complete sense. Yeah, I don't know if we need to say much more about Valencia, but other than this has been a long time coming. It's just weird, like from the days of like, I just remember I was there when they played the back three and Manmark, Bale, Benzema, Cristiano in January 2015. I was there that day, and it was I think we hadn't lost in months, or like for half the season, and that game was shocking. It was bad, and Nicolas Otamendi was there. I remember it was just to go from there where I'm like, okay, this is like wow, they're a big Spanish team, to now where they're being relegated is shocking. It's sad, and I know they won the La Ligas with Benitez. Any thoughts? Is this just Peter Lim, like a decade of Peter Lim, or has he just not been good, or is there more to it?
Yeah, it's the systematic bleeding out of a club that was, as you say, kind of one of the forces in Spain and in Europe. I mean, we're coming up, just gone 20 years removed from them being in Champions League finals against Real Madrid. So yeah, this is a team and a club that has been kind of bled dry by Peter Lim. And granted, they were in dire financial straits before he came in, but those finances have been, there's certainly some mist, some fog between what we see, what we hear from the club, and what's going on in their accounting room. So yeah, there's uncertainty. I think they will try and escape. I still don't think it's impossible that they can stay up this season, but we're certainly reaching a breaking point where either Peter Lim is going to have to go, or Valencia will get relegated and he's going to lose a lot of money on it anyway. So yeah, they're in a strange position. I think Los Che, I really do feel for their fans. I mean, again, I know they're not the most popular with Real Madrid at the moment, but there's a lot of people who've just seen their club decimated by one man and his vanity, I guess you have to say.
Yeah. I feel bad for anyone in the city. Lucas Navarrete is in Valencia. Like he covers Real Madrid for Managing Madrid, and he hates the club, but he's also there, and he's like, man, like they neglected the city, so he's like right at the heart of it, at the hate of Real Madrid, and the feel bad for the people and the city, and maybe he doesn't feel as bad for the club though. I don't know if he feels that. What are so with Lim? Is the rumor that like he essentially has he been like trying to take money out of the club after buying it? Is he like trying to like gain the money he spent on the club back? Like, is that what the rumor is? The rumor, like, I'm not saying that's what anyone said.
Yeah, in theory, you guess that he's trying to make a profit on Valencia because, I mean, he bought it for a good deal of money. He invested quite a bit in his first kind of 2-3 seasons. I mean, they did win the Copa del Rey under Marcelino, beating Barcelona in the final. So they did have success early on in those days. They made the Champions League despite appointing Gary Neville at one point. But yeah, Valencia did do well initially, and since there's been kind of a very clear kind of turning off of the taps in terms of money, and you expect that after a couple of seasons of losses, once you drop out the Champions League and once you don't have that money to reinvest, he starts looking at those accounts, starts seeing he's losing money, and starts kind of basically saying, well, we need to become sustainable so I can sell this and get my money back. That's, I guess, the closest thing we have to kind of a working theory of it. But if they get relegated, then they're going to be in bigger trouble than they are now. So yeah, it's a case of poor management and poor decisions leading to more poor decisions and ultimately potential ruin.
Yeah. I see Getafe are down in 15th. Any thoughts on them? When did I lost track of the exact year Mason Greenwood left them? Was he just there last year, or was that 2 years ago?
Last season, yeah, I think
last season. Yeah, that was last season.
Left at the end of last season.
So just no more Greenwood, and their offense lost a little bit.
Yeah, again, another team that's kind of lost a lot of investment. I mean, there was a time when Getafe were picking up kind of some of the better players from that lower half of the division and putting together a side that was quite interesting. I mean, Greenwood being another one, and I mean, that's a topic for another day. But yeah, Getafe were kind of one of the side that you could expect, kind of like Mallorca are now, to pick up your Johan Mahicas of the world and then to do quite well and maybe be in and around mid-table, but a difficult out for teams like Real Madrid or for teams like Real Sociedad. Now, they're basically relying on Jose Bordalas to achieve miracles, and Jose Bordalas does know how to do so. I mean, I don't think he's ever kind of achieved below expectations in terms of kind of budget or in terms of club expectations since he came into La Liga about 10 years ago now. So yeah, they're basically relying on his know-how, his nous, his kind of defensive acumen to get them out of a tough situation. And so far, he's just about doing it. I do think he's benefiting from the fact that there's some bad teams in La Liga this year. There are 4 or 5 sides that just cannot score, don't have it in them, and don't necessarily have the resources to get themselves out there.
Interesting. Yeah, just looking at those teams: Getafe, Leganés, Espanyol, Valladolid, Valencia, and then you can take your pick: Las Palmas, Sevilla, and Osasuna cannot create either. Osasuna are interesting. They did give Barcelona problems, I think. Yeah, anything about them? Are they different this year? I'm used to them being like, if I'm not wrong, they're not always near 10th. They're closer to 15th for me. They're not a mid-table proper, right?
So under Arrasate, they did really well for 3 years after they came up. So they finished, I think it was 10th, 11th, 10th. And then last year, I think they were slightly lower, maybe about 13th. Arrasate left in the summer, and that was kind of a big deal for them, essentially. Arrasate was a club figure who was the face of this Osasuna. I mean, Osasuna were very much on the verge of administration about 10 years ago. They were in the second division and just escaped relegation to the third tier. So between then and making that Copa del Rey final against Real Madrid, they'd kind of been through the wars. And Arrasate was the man who got them promoted, stabilized them in La Liga again, gave them that cup run, got them into Europe as well, off the back of an 8th place finish. So his departure is seen as kind of a real break from what fans have become used to. Vicente Moreno has come in, former Espanyol, Almeria. He had a rather dreadful spell there, but they look a little bit revitalized. Brian Zaragoza has got a lot to do with that as well. But they beat Barcelona 4-2 at El Sadar and looked absolutely outstanding in that game. Since they've been kind of consistently tricky to beat without necessarily being better than a lot of their opposition. So, I mean, they've still got Ante Budimir, who was 4th or 5th top scorer last season. And between him and Zaragoza, that's kind of powering them to what is probably going to be around that mid-table finish. I will put them closer to 10th and 15th this season. I'll give you that.
No, I got that wrong. Yeah, again, I keep track of the Champions League winners and the top teams. Just a fair disclaimer here. That's what you're here for.
That's fair.
Well, I guess so. And on Arrasate, is he the big difference for Mallorca? Is that why they've improved, or are there personnel there too? Because they seem to be a much stronger outfit than last season.
Yeah, this summer not so much, but in general over the last few seasons they've recruited very well. I mean, Kyle Larin is a good striker, but if Kyle Larin, Vedat Murici, Abdon Prats is the other one who's kind of useful. They've got some useful forwards up there. Sergi Darder is still there, who was at one time a one-man team for Espanyol. And essentially they've gone from Aguirre, who did an excellent job for Mallorca. He got them to a cup finalist again as well. He was a really good manager for them, but I think Aguirre's style was a little more conservative and looking a little bit to kind of keep Mallorca in games as opposed to win games. Whereas Arrasate, I think, is a touch more positive. His teams are very Basque in the sense that they look to kind of press you high and force you into mistakes and really kind of go after the opposition and get in behind you. And that's kind of been seen with kind of a slightly higher quality of player, I would say, in the last kind of few years, and a slight shift of approach. I think Arrasate's doing a great job. And the other big factor for me, Simon Costa in midfield, who I don't know if you're familiar with him, you've probably seen him fouling Modric or somebody else in midfield for Real Madrid over the last few years, but he is a really, really solid defensive midfielder. And I think between him, the useful forwards, and kind of some flying fullbacks, Arrasate's done a good job.
Nice. Good to know. And that leaves us the last team that really has changed, if I'm seeing between last season and this, is Rayo. They finished 17th last year. They're 9th now. Is the league just different, or are they much better?
I think they are better. I think you have to take into account that they lost Andoni Iraola, which is not an easy kind of blow to take. I mean, you can see what he's doing with Bournemouth. His management has just been ridiculous, essentially, since he came into coaching in Spain. So they lost him. That was a big blow. In came Francisco, who had been at Elche before, he'd been at Almeria before, and tends to get jobs in the top 5 in Segunda and the bottom 5 in La Liga, and sort of about play to expectations. They sacked him and brought in Inigo Perez, who's their current manager, about midway through last season. He just about stabilised the boat and just kind of kept them from rocking down into Segunda. And now I think they're starting to improve again. And I respect Perez a lot because he's got cojones. I mean, he's more or less left Raul de Tomas out of the team, who is their record signing. James Rodriguez comes in the summer, plays one game from the start, and is now going to leave the club in January. He does not give a jot about star players, to be perfectly honest, and I think they're a better team for it. And I think that's where you see them kind of shifting a little bit more to what we saw under Iraola. We saw Real Madrid have problems against them. That 3-3 draw was quite instructive of their style and what they want to be. We saw them give Barcelona problems as well, even though Barcelona got the win. Atleti drew with them as well in Vallecas. So they are a tough side to beat again. And I think they're lacking a goal scorer still. Again, another sporting director in David Cobeño, who, if I'm not mistaken, is former Real Madrid academy. But he is their sporting director, and he is another who has a blind spot in terms of the striker position. But admittedly, maybe it's not blind spot. Maybe you just can't afford a good number 9 because they are the most expensive players on the market. So Rayo, once again, a good team, fun to watch. I go to Viejos quite often, not purely because it's the cheapest team in Madrid, but definitely some of the reason. And yeah, they're good to watch, fun to be at, and just lacking a little bit of a clinical edge.
Yeah, and on that note, now to close out, I got a big picture question, which is like just something been on my mind a lot because I've just watched Real Madrid not really try in the fall sometimes and get away with performances that I just feel like maybe they wouldn't get away with in the Premier League perhaps. And even with Iraola, like you look at he's at Rayo, that are mid-table team, a mid or even lower mid-table team in the Premier League pick him up, and they're 7th now. They can give him better strikers because they can just afford more players. And, you know, maybe the strikers aren't the best strikers in the Premier League, but they are far better strikers than Rayo could offer. At the same, just financially, they can't afford them. And even though you're technically up against tougher competition where everyone has that money, you also get what you want. So you can put a product out there that is to your expectations. So my question is, like, as someone who follows La Liga, like, how much do you see the money making a difference in terms of the strength of the league compared to the Premier League? And I ask this a lot. Maybe fans don't love it. The reason I do is because I don't believe the difference happens overnight. Like, the Premier League was always been richer my whole life, but Messi, Neymar, Suarez, Bale, Benzema, Ronaldo were in La Liga, even when the Premier League TV money was crazy. But I do think over time it compounds. And when Emery and Lopetegui and now Iraola, like these coaches going and experiencing success against top 4 teams that they didn't even experience to the same success point in La Liga because the players are just so much worse than the top teams. Do you think that adds up? Do you think Real Madrid could have come, like, do you think Jude would have had a chance to bail out some of the performances we had if he was against Iraola's Bournemouth instead of like Bordalas' Getafe that can't afford anyone? You think it makes a difference?
It's a really good question. I think the kind of game state is different because with Iraola at Bournemouth, he has a 40 million striker in Evan Nielsen who costs 2/3 of, well, more than 2/3, about 70% of what Rayo Vallecano can spend on their entire squad. So that obviously makes a huge difference in terms of what he can aspire to. But having said that, most Premier League teams, I do think, aspire to more than your La Liga team will in that sense. So you have an Iraola who comes in, goes to Bournemouth and says, I'm going to play my way. And to Iraola's credit, he did that at Rayo already, and it worked because he's a good coach and he managed to kind of spot some good players. So that worked at Rayo, but at Bournemouth, he's got more resources to kind of carry out what he's doing. Now you look at Southampton, who look dreadful in the Premier League, and I can't say that I'm keeping a very close eye on what's happening at Southampton, but I know that they're trying to kind of play their way out of trouble. You look at the likes of kind of Brentford, who play much better football now, and yeah, those teams kind of down the bottom, they have better players, but they also aspire to be more of their kind of own identity and more attacking than I think the La Liga sides do. Whereas if you go to Real Madrid, Getafe they don't have an issue with sticking 10 men behind the ball. And equally, your Jaime Matas of this world, your Luis Mias of this world, your Carlos Aleñas, those players are fine being told to run around for 90 minutes and track Real Madrid stars. Whereas if you get a player who's cost you 25 million, I'm thinking about you, Arnaud Danjuma, it's much harder to get him to run around and kind of defend for 90 minutes than it is somebody who's in La Liga and is earning kind of, I don't know, 10 to 15 grand a week. So I think those sides are less ambitious against big teams. And that allows Real Madrid to constantly be in a position to kind of win those games. But also there's less space to work with. The Premier League is much more open. Teams are much more ambitious. And they think that they can kind of go toe-to-toe with these big teams. And quite often they can. But I think Bellingham would have more space in the Premier League. And I think you kind of see it with the likes of Mbappe in Liga, and I think teams that come, or big players that come to La Liga, often struggle more to score goals than they do in other leagues, and Bellingham perhaps being the exception.
Yeah, I think La Liga defensively is as strong as the Premier League for sure for that reason. I wonder if like the total. I think on the net on both ends, like I don't think Real Madrid would have been on track to have 99 points in May, like with 2 games left. Like I don't think we would have been that high. Like 93 points with 36 games. That's what we were. But I agree. Like just on, I don't. I guess like it's so weird because I don't think it matters as much for Real Madrid in the sense that like we can beat those teams and win the Champions League. I do wonder though if we would just even be in a race for the title some of these years the way we care like treat the league. Like it's not a league you can afford to not take seriously at any point. But the flip is that our players are so good that no matter what league you put them in any game, the floor is very high. Even without tactics, there's always a chance.
I think that's valid, and I think also it's partly a function of the managers that you've had in some senses, because I think Zidane, I'll give him more credit than Ancelotti in terms of what he did in La Liga. I think he was more consistent and more focused on La Liga, but even so, he was still a man for the big occasion and for the Champions League. Ancelotti, very much a man for the Champions League in terms of where his focus is. And if you look at even the successful seasons, I mean, with Bellingham last season in particular, it was essentially Bellingham were bust until December. And then Real Madrid started sorting themselves out in January and started kind of playing towards where their ceiling was in the Champions League. And that works for Real Madrid most seasons because they tend to turn it on in February, March, April and win stuff. But in that one season where Xavi's Barcelona did win La Liga, it was because they built up such a lead already in La Liga. I think Real Madrid start to see themselves dropping off and see themselves so far away, and it's a struggle to kind of get themselves up for those games. So yeah, I think that kind of, I don't think it's necessarily complacency, but that focus on the Champions League and that focus on the end of the season has kind of worked against Real Madrid in La Liga, and that's why. I mean, I've seen a lot about Real Madrid having this dominant era where they win 8 or 9 leagues out of 10 or 11 years while Barcelona are in this state. But I think that's part of the reason why that hasn't happened so far. Partly because of Ancelotti and the way he manages, partly because of their focus, and also just, the way that they've been kind of coached in the last few years is not set up for that, but has ultimately brought them 15 Champions Leagues. So who are we to argue with it?
Yeah, and I guess one other thing that I think can make, I guess I suspect it's a fallacy that can make La Liga feel like it hasn't lost as much ground as it has, is that since Spanish like coaching culture is just so advanced, like we saw it in the Euros, like when a Spanish team gets to play their style, the culture is just conducive to guys like Zubimendi, Rodri, dominating midfield, whereas English football, they're squeezing players in who don't fit together, like Phil Foden. But they're playing subpar players who shouldn't be platformed, and their culture is like they don't have a possession based like appreciation for the aesthetics of football. And in Spain, it's not just aesthetics; it's very tactical. Like it leads to these blocks that are more organized than the rest. Midfielders are developed better. But my point with that is like any team that can hold the ball this season is, like yesterday, a lot of people were saying, has hurt Real Madrid. And I do think long term, like a more dominant league is the one with the best attackers. Like defense is always a function of organization, which always comes down to some level of like run, put in effort, like try. And that can be coached on some level and even into more talented players. But you can't take a team that, like a team defends in a block often because they don't have any other option, because they can't hold on to the ball if they want to. And in Spain, I worry that like the players will always hold on to the ball better than their weekly wages. Like relative to weekly wages, they will always have the best talent. At some point, just the absolute numbers matter less is just my worry. And it's also paradoxical because Real Madrid won't stop winning Champions League. So it won't be obvious that like we won't stop. The Premier League, they'll always be tired. The league being stronger means those teams are more tired coming into April, May. So paradoxically, we have a better shot against them the stronger their league is. And with every Champions League we win, the narrative then shifts away from the Premier League being dominant, when maybe the picture is more nuanced.
Yeah, again, an interesting thought. And I think Spain is going through a bit of a weird period right now in the sense that you had 4 or 5 teams below Real Madrid and Barcelona all go through transition phases at the same time. So you had Sevilla, who obviously have fallen off the face of a cliff after kind of 1 or 2 years of really bad management, leading to more bad management, and kind of having to sort themselves out financially. Villarreal themselves, after Emery went, they made a couple of choices that didn't go well in the management department, and also a couple of down years in terms of recruitment. Real Sociedad, as we say, losing players and going to have to kind of rebuild in a certain sense. So you have a lot of those kind of second tier teams that were competing for Europa Leagues are kind of going through phases where they're trying to get back to where they were. And then I think as well, the one thing I'd maybe counter your point with is that Ancelotti's success, and the one thing that he repeats ad nauseum, or has done since he came back, if we're good defensively, we'll win games. And that's kind of proven to be quite right, because I mean, I think last season they were by far the best defense in La Liga. Antonio Rudiger was absolutely rock solid, and Jude Bellingham scored the goals at the other end until Vinicius kind of hit his kind of flying form in the second half of the season. So I think Ancelotti at the very least has that kind of mentality, and I think it's proven to work. And I think that's, again, my worry for Barcelona this season, is that their attack is the best in Spain, really, in terms of goals, but also just in terms of what they can do to other teams. But defensively, that's where they've really kind of fallen off. And we talk about finding out that press, as you were kind of alluding to earlier, and how suicidal it is in inverted commas. Other teams have cracked that on occasions this season, and they've not been able to kind of deal with that and keep clean sheets in the same way that Atleti have. And even Real Madrid in recent weeks have been better defensively, even if they look really vulnerable still. So yeah, I still think that if you're trying to build a winning team, the team with the best defense generally tends to win the league. And how you get to that in terms of possession, I mean, Pep Guardiola generally has the best defense in the Premier League because his teams are so mistake-free and they basically don't allow the opposition a space to breathe. And how you get to that is obviously kind of a choice of style in terms of what you have in terms of resources. But for me, I still see kind of being able to keep clean sheets as the key to winning La Liga titles.
It's been a few years since Tebas's profit, the whole sustainability thing came into play, where you can't spend more. What's the feeling around La Liga right now with the whole Barcelona situation? It has two questions. Has this helped the league become more profitable, or are they just falling behind in the sense that everyone else just takes on more debt and venture capital anyways, and that you're just competing with these teams and the capital is not going anywhere for those teams, is my point. This endless wallet that some of the teams access because owners want to make profits, venture capital, or advertisers have insane amounts of money. This world of clubs being in debt, it sometimes feels like there's no consequence to it. And I guess that plays out directly when the same league that enforced the rules then changes it for Barcelona. Or I guess I don't even pay attention, to be honest, to some of those things. My understanding is the rules were changed, that most clubs were angry, that Real didn't even speak out against it. So I guess what's the sentiment first around the league? What happened there?
Yeah, there's a general outrage at kind of what's going on. There's not really... The thing with the La Liga kind of rules is that nobody really has... I mean, we have access to the rules, but not some of the kind of clauses in essence. So right now, with the Dani Olmo situation, which is obviously what's making the headlines and what's caused Atleti, Las Palmas, Leganés, Real Sociedad, name any club in La Liga almost, has made a statement about this and said that they are unhappy with it. The thing that's made them unhappy is that Barcelona have been able to register Dani Olmo despite missing the deadline. Now, Barcelona say that the deadline, they had submitted the contract documents, which is what La Liga in theory require. Nobody knows if La Liga have it in their rules that they can ask for kind of proof of payment, or whether that's something that they just ask for because, quite understandably, fairly and justly, I think they've been burnt before with Barcelona and contracts that didn't get paid up. So yeah, that makes sense. That's meant to come in as a rule in February, but we don't know if it's in there now. So there's various factors kind of contributing to it. There's politics, obviously. Tebas, I think there's an interesting kind of political thing with Barcelona because Real Madrid and Barcelona are obviously allied over the Super League. That's why Florentino hasn't spoken out about this. I mean, you heard it in his assembly. Barcelona are one of the big clubs. We need to help each other because we're in the same boat, kind of thing. So Real Madrid and Barcelona have that tie. But Tebas having a terrible relationship with Florentino, essentially disagreeing on him about everything except the fact that he's a Real Madrid fan. Those two are never going to see eye to eye. So for Tebas, Barcelona is still the ball in play. He can still move things with Barcelona, and he can still achieve things if he can kind of get them on board with La Liga kind of, I don't know, projects or ideas or in terms of signing up for stuff. So he still has a reason to cozy up to Barcelona, if that makes sense. Whereas he doesn't have a reason to cozy up to Real Madrid. And there's this kind of disparate love triangle that's going on between the three of them that doesn't really work and causes all these all these situations. So I don't know if I've answered your question there, but yeah, that's kind of where the salary limit stuff is. And in terms of kind of a more general take, I think there's arguments that it's been a good thing. I mean, Barcelona are kind of a case apart, but no La Liga side has gone bust after the pandemic. You've seen the CVC deal, which I get doesn't quite work for every team in La Liga. Barcelona and Real Madrid being the obvious examples. Athletic Club didn't really need it, but La Liga sides are not going bust. And Tebas's point is actually that the money will stop, and the fact that you will see Premier League sides eventually punished, or you'll see owners pull out, or you'll see kind of the bubble burst a little bit, and that is going to affect those teams. You see it a little bit in La Liga. I mean, the likes of Bordeaux have gone down to kind of the third tier. You've seen teams in Italy struggle financially a lot and have to kind of fire sell their players. I mean, Parma have gone down to kind of the bottom of the pyramid as well after being a European side in the 2000s. So Tebas's point is essentially that, look, you might not be able to compete on a European level with West Ham for a player like, I don't know, Gio Lo Celso, for example, who's come back to Betis in very kind of disparate terms to what he was on in the Premier League. But you're not going to go bust. You're going to have a football team there at the end of the day. You're going to have a stadium to go to, and it's going to be owned by you. And that's a kind of fair argument, whether everyone wants to sign up for that. I mean, football is a business of emotions. So there's kind of two sides to it and kind of different dynamics that are kind of pulling at each other. I think it's a fair argument. And with all the clubs having signed up for it, then he's quite right to kind of try and enforce the rules, even if he perhaps doesn't in the same way for every club.
Yeah, I things like that are why I don't get so upset at the mention of a Super League. It's not like Tebas isn't some man of the people that they pretend he is. He doesn't have some mandate. He doesn't rule, he doesn't see himself as a protector of the small teams in Spain or anything. And that's why I am an advocate for the Super League in that I just assume it's some centralized force that runs it no matter what. And if that's the case, letting the teams that win do it instead of I guess this dude just is there because he ended up there. Now he just he's like, okay, I'm not relinquishing any leverage I have over Real Madrid or Barcelona and I guess this might be a prolonged battle. Maybe it's like 100-year battle. Maybe we get the Super League in 100 years because guys like this will never go away. And yes, it's just crazy to hear this whole thing. And it's just so contradictory because they all signed up to turn a profit, but he's making this exception for a team that pulled all these levers that would have went under anyways, because even after signing up for the rules, they do a bunch of crazy things. And so really is a slap in the face to most teams. It's so funny.
I think it's kind of a fair argument on the one side because you get these teams that are obviously angry about this and teams that have had to sell players as a result of this. But I do think that the idea or the argument that Barcelona are not being punished by this is also incorrect because, I mean, they lost Leo Messi. I mean, literally, you could not have taken anything from Barcelona that was more important to them than Leo Messi. So that has an obvious impact. And you look in recent years, I mean, Nico Williams was a deal that they couldn't do because of this. The biggest asset in football, both in terms of a moneymaker, but also in terms of an icon, in terms of somebody that brings people to the club. I mean, how many players have signed to play with Leo Messi for Barcelona? So yeah, he was a major loss, obviously, but you look at the way that they couldn't bring in Nico Williams this summer. There's other examples of kind of players that haven't arrived because of their finances. And even last season, I mean, okay, Gundogan's left this summer, so Dani Olmo can come in, and maybe they didn't have the money for Dani Olmo, but they're playing with Hector Fort and Gerard Martinez, their backup fullbacks as well, as we discussed earlier. So they are suffering the consequences of this, just perhaps because Laporta is very good at controlling the narrative, very good at putting out the right information. It seems like Barcelona are kind of always winning and kind of coming out of this in a way that I'm not sure is quite reflected in the reality of things, and particularly with their asset sales. I mean, Barca Vision is a bit of a trope. It seems to have not basically exist in terms of what their sale has been, but that's caused them to have major losses in their accounts in the last few years. That's why their salary limit situation has been so bad in the last 2-3 years. And more recently, kind of their other asset sales. I mean, they've sold 25% of their TV rights for 25 years. They've also sold some of their VIP seats for the coming Camp Nou when that's finally renovated. So this is a team that's losing a lot of income, and it's income that Real Madrid will have in the next kind of 5, 10, 15, 25 years that Barcelona just won't be able to count on. So I think Barcelona are probably bending exactly what was intended for them to be able to use in terms of the rules, especially Andreas Christensen being injured, being used to register Dani Olmo. That is not the spirit of the rule, as they will probably argue in court for Dani Olmo being registered. But on the flip side of that, I do think they are losing out in terms of a lot of things that people think are just kind of being ignored.
That makes sense. Yeah, I didn't realize. Now I'm looking into it more. So they've been inflating the value of their media company, essentially Barca Vision, right, with their TV or whatever that stuff is. I mean, I don't know why they're acting like they're a production company.
Yep.
They're acting like they got a little Warner Brothers Studios lot just sitting there making movies. You know, you want a 50% stake in this? We make propaganda for Hollywood. It's so funny that they go about it that way.
Hollywood is a good name for it because there's a lot of sets with nothing behind them.
Yeah, literally. And so they've been masking accounts, and that's crazy. Just the sale of Barca Vision had much more fantasy than reality. The initial investors who had agreed to take on the role of purchasing a stake quickly disappeared. They're selling to like socios.com. Isn't that the weird like NFT crypto like token holder thing that doesn't have any legitimacy yet?
So they essentially sold 200 million. For 200 million, they sold 49.5% of Barca Vision, which is their online NFT kind of crypto blockchain wing of the company, basically online monetization. But with that sale, they only got about, over the last 3-4 years, and with various sales of that stake, they've only had 55 million of that come into the company. But on the flip side of that, they inflated their accounts because they said that 200 million sale proves that the other half of this is worth 200 million. So they added 200 million to their accounts so that it looked like they were in profit or in much better situation than they were. And now that 200 million has been taken back off their accounts because they've been unable to prove that that half of Barca Vision is worth the half that they sold it for originally. And now it's at a quarter of the value, essentially. So yeah, it is playing havoc with their finances still. Even if you can argue that Laporta did still get a benefit because they were able to bring in Rafinha, Lewandowski, and Jules Koundé, and eventually win a league title out of it.
Yeah. And that's why, as a Real Madrid fan, it's so frustrating. It's like, hey, we should be stepping on their throats and blowing the club up, and we're kind of letting them linger. Like, it feels like we could finish them off as a club if we just won every year. Maybe they wouldn't.
What would you have to argue about?
What
would you have to argue about if you finished off Barcelona?
That's true, but like, you know, we could like make fun of their fans and be like, hey, like Messi's a thing of the past. Like that used to be a thing. Like it would be the best. Like talking about them as if they were a relic of the past would be the biggest victory. But it wouldn't. Yeah, no, like you said, it won't happen. I've always argued, and I don't really say it in the way I used to say it, and I never will. But I've long argued that even with the Negreira scandal, I think we're at a point where even if they did things that were harmful, the numbers have gotten to a point like the raw math. Everyone who works at Real Madrid in Barcelona is making so much money, and that money got here because of the Messi Ronaldo era, So I don't even know if it's in Real Madrid's interest to tell the story of cheating. Like, I don't know if it's in our interest to expose them anymore. Like, I can't believe I'm saying this on a public platform, and that's why I'm grateful for Managing Madrid. You can say anything you want. You can be honest. But I don't think it's in our interest to eliminate Barcelona. It's like there's a term. It's like in other domains, it's known as the Hegelian like dialectic. Like, you have two sides opposing each other, and like the back and forth creates a landscape where even if maybe you would otherwise not pay attention at all to football, but because there's this back and forth, two opposing sides, you're interested in their rivalry more than you don't care about the sport. You don't care about the aesthetic of someone dribbling past someone, but these two are rivals, and now that gets you interested. And I fundamentally believe that's been a core part of the growth of the global game, the Messi Ronaldo rivalry, Real Madrid Barcelona. Like, if I had to pick one thing, I guess if you had to pick one factor that grew football, would that be number one? Like, if you had to, like, the biggest, if any one factor was bigger than the rest, is that one the biggest?
I'd say in terms of what grew La Liga and what grew Real Madrid and Barcelona, I'd say that's maybe the biggest. Also, the kind of the wide distribution of TV in terms of being available to watch games has obviously changed in the last 15 years. But I think more than anything is the fact that Messi and Ronaldo were so big because of Barcelona and Real Madrid. I think if they'd been at Milan, if they'd been at two Premier League sides, it would have been obviously huge as a rivalry. But there aren't any clubs in Europe and in the world that have the kind of both the financial and both the kind of competitive context that they have, as well as the socio-political context, as well as the kind of background. And there are two clubs, like you say, that directly coexist off the other's existence. Without one, the other one couldn't exist. It's the same as I forget who says it now, but there's definitely somebody famous that said if you didn't have Real Madrid or Barcelona, they'd have to invent one, because essentially they need each other to kind of force this narrative battle. I mean, I'm from Scotland, and you see it with Celtic and Rangers. Like, Celtic couldn't exist without Rangers, and Rangers got relegated to the fourth tier of Scottish football and had to come back up. They formed a new club because they can't exist without each other. It's just a necessity of their kind of narrative and what drives those two clubs together in terms of in terms of the back and forth. And each side will tell their own narrative, and fans will identify with it, rightly or wrongly. There's probably truth, but they're ultimately probably more similar than they'd care to admit. And that's why it's so fascinating, is because you have these kind of two storylines that both propagate in positive and negative senses for their rivals. But yeah, it's more fascinating, and Messi and Ronaldo was more fascinating because they were at those two clubs and they could sell those narratives. You could sell the La Masia narrative versus kind of the superstar narrative for what Real Madrid have with the Galacticos and Ronaldo. And I don't think we've ever seen such a clear kind of identification of two sides. I mean, you look at Ferguson's great sides for Manchester United, brilliant sides, but you couldn't really say what that side was apart from Ferguson. There's a class of 92, obviously, but Ferguson kind of outlasted all of that. You look at Liverpool's great team, and that was kind of Shankly's boys. Again, a manager, but not necessarily an identity that goes beyond the kind of manager in terms of the players that were actually there. Whereas Barcelona and Real Madrid definitely had, I think, more of a reach in terms of their narrative, in terms of what they could sell. And that played into just how good it was, especially when Mourinho and Guardiola were there.
Yeah. And it's kind of like the Batman or Joker, or like why every good film needs an antagonist. Even like how political parties will use their signaling to build a sense of loyalty. It's just human nature and psychology. And yeah, the antagonist plays such a key role in that. So I agree. And so that's my point. Even as a fan, if you feel like your club, it's a bit contradictory. Like, as a fan, you might want your club to eliminate Barcelona, but the bottom line won't get better if you do that. Like, you don't make more money, you don't sell more jerseys, you don't generate more conversations in bars if there's no antagonist. And and yes, it's really funny how human psychology works in that sense. So I guess closing out here, I had one more thought, can't think of it now, but I guess we can close out here. It was fun having you on, Ruairidh. Thanks for coming on and talking about all the different things going on in Spanish football. We'll definitely see you back again here sometime. Who's winning La Liga, if you had to gun to your head right now?
Real Madrid. I still think they'll come through.
Awesome.
For some positivity on a day when Real Madrid fans need it.
Yeah. The logical part of me agrees. Just it's after a defeat like that, it's hard to believe in anything. But I hope you're right. And thanks for coming on, and see you all around. Thanks for tuning in, everyone.